Elena Tepelinsky is the next speaker. She's a global energy industry leader and partner at Pillsbury law firm, where she is trusted advisor to governments, nuclear owner-operators, reactor and equipment suppliers, investors, architect engineering companies, and other complex nuclear transactional and regulatory matters. So you can see the scope of expertise Elena carries, and that's a very unique perspective. Elena frequently serves as lead outside counsel on new build projects, equipment and fuel procurements, M&A transactions, and joint ventures in the nuclear sector. She worked on transactions for the moment for more than 30 countries. And she's a member of the Strategic Advisory Group of the International Bank for Nuclear Infrastructure Implementation Organization. And we will talk more about this unique organization and their programs that many countries could benefit, and we can deploy more nuclear with that. What do you think has held U.S. back from more investment into nuclear sector, and what happening in other countries? What held them back?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the U.S., you see, today is fully committed to nuclear, right? I'm in Washington, D.C., and very few things are bipartisan. Nuclear is actually bipartisan. But the U.S. does everything with private funding. And outside of the U.S., most countries, nuclear industries are owned by the state. So when the government makes a decision, especially in countries that have money, countries like China, like Russia, they invest the money, they put together 5, 10, 15 years plans, they get things done. In the U.S., we rely on industry, which in a way is great because it encourages innovation, and we have so many designs and we have so many technological breakthroughs, but technological breakthroughs don't necessarily lead to projects. So now we're at a place where we need to tie in the technological innovation we have and the political support to try to figure out, kind of to Charles's point, how do we actually implement projects? How do we bring in players that can finance projects, that can develop them in an intelligent and a smart way, the same way that the UEA has done, with their government funding and their vision? So that's the challenge that's ahead of us.
What are the trends in new kinds of financing that make it easier to find large nuclear projects? And that actually returns to Dale's point on appetites for return and how to make it attractive. Right now we invest short-term getting into game only if we expect return in a year or 5. But with nuclear, it usually takes a decade before we get anything back. So with alternative financing and this new trends, how we can instill those money coming into nuclear sector, giving those returns coming not so soon?
So one thing that I'm seeing in my practice, certainly as far as investing into technology and companies developing technology, you're starting to see lots of non-traditional players, sovereign wealth funds, private equity in particular. Private equity would normally never invest into technology before, but there are a number of companies very seriously looking at investors into companies that are further along, but they still don't have returns coming in for the next couple of years. And that is really because of the energy transition. It's because of the ESG standards. Everybody is under pressure to comply with ESG. They recognize, I think, universally that nuclear needs to be part of the energy transition in order for the energy transition to happen. And because of that, you're having these non-traditional players take more risks than they normally would investing into nuclear, and I think that's very exciting.
So we already touched a little bit on the International Bank for Nuclear Infrastructure in your intro, but could you tell more about it and how, let's say, nuclear newcomers can take advantage of this initiative, or how can we participate? Like, I'm speaking on behalf of Kazakhstan, let's say. Tell us more.
A significant amount of infrastructure globally is financed by the World Bank and by other international financing institutions. Almost all of these institutions today exclude nuclear. There is no good scientific reason behind it. It is purely political because there's a small contingent in those institutions, in the members of those institutions that are pro-nuclear. And also these institutions have never had experience financing nuclear. The World Bank financed one nuclear project in Italy in 1959. That's the first and last project they financed. But these organizations catalyze a huge amount, trillions, I'm not talking about billions, I'm talking about trillions of dollars of capital for renewables, for natural gas, for other infrastructure projects. And an idea was born about 2 years ago. Well, why don't we create this type of bank, but focus on financing nuclear? And now we're not just talking about reactors, because To get to this 3 times of nuclear capacity that we have today, we're going to need supply chain investment, right? All of those reactors are going to need equipment, for which we currently don't have factories to produce the equipment. We're going to need fuel. We're going to have costs around spent fuel management. Newcomer countries that don't have infrastructure are going to need to develop regulatory bodies, grid systems, pretty much everything around a nuclear power plant. So if we had a bank, basically a World Bank for nuclear, which is this infrastructure bank that we're developing, you could really catalyze the trillions and trillions of dollars of finance. So this concept today has been socialized with several dozen countries, stakeholders within those countries, private industries, NGOs, lots of different people, and nobody has said that it is a bad idea. So that is a point of validation. And in fact, we've gotten letters of support from lots of different organizations to stand up this bank. So it's really on the way of happening. It is certainly ambitious, right? Standing up a new infrastructure bank is no small feat. But if you actually look at the history of establishment of these types of institutions, when there was political will, they got established in 2 to 3 years. So right now, we think we have the political will for nuclear among countries that have nuclear currently, but also among those that want to have nuclear, that currently don't, or want to expand their nuclear programs. So we're really hopeful that this institution will become a reality. It'll be a treaty organization. And importantly, it will do a lot of what we're talking about in the panel. It's not just about getting governments to invest dollars. It's investing that patient capital from governments to catalyze the trillions of dollars that are available for everything else today, but not for nuclear. So that's what we're hoping to do.
We have the wheel, we have ideas, we already kind of put together the structure. What can we learn from failed projects, unsuccessful projects, to make sure that this initiative gets us where we want to be and we get as much as homework done before we jump into new projects?
Some time ago, somebody asked me that same question, and I said, this is a really good question about how do projects fail, why do projects fail, right? So let's put together a chart of all the failed nuclear projects, and let's see why they failed. And I can tell you the answer of all the projects, about 80% failed because of financing, lack thereof. About 20% failed because of lack of political support, change of government, but the rest were all failures of financing. It was the government didn't have enough financing, or the private sector didn't have enough financing, or both. So really the lessons learned from the projects is that we need to structure projects at the start with financing in mind. Because what normally happens is that somebody have the idea of a project, there is a demand, there are stakeholders come together, they put together all the contracts, they hire lawyers who write the contracts, and then they go to the bankers, right? Because the bankers usually don't want to talk to you beforehand. And then the bankers say, sorry, this is not a bankable project. And then it's too late, right? So that's actually one of the purposes of IBNIs, that it would develop codes and standards to drive successful projects, but it also would be there at the very front end to try to help companies and governments structure projects in a successful way so that they actually succeed and they can attract external financing.
Can you elaborate or start a little bit on what areas in policymaking, specific areas that we need to advance to make sure that nuclear development gets enough support?
One of the issues with policy is that it's been a whack-a-mole sort of game. We find one specific problem and we just really focus on it, like HALO. Right? I mean, for years we talked about we're going to need the high assay low enriched uranium for advanced reactors. And then, okay, now we're only going to focus on that problem. Or we're going to focus on, one part of the regulation, only that issue. But nuclear, if you look at what it takes to actually develop a nuclear program or any one specific project, there are about 20 different things that go into it, right? It's the financing, it's the licensing, it's an environmental impact assessment, it's the public acceptance. So we need to think about policies holistically, and that's what I think is missing. You really need to think about, okay, what are the pieces that today are keeping this industry from getting to 3x, right? For example, in the U.S., we have all the utilities saying, yes, we want nuclear, but we don't want to be the first. What is needed to get them to be the first? Not the third and fourth and fifth, right? They need an incentive. They need other incentives for off-takers that are currently not in the nuclear industry. So we need to think about holistically what's missing, and that's, for me, the missing piece.
Talking more about the newcomers, and I think how can we assure lenders to invest in particular area or particular region, taking into account all the challenges we have with currency that might be having hyperinflation at some point, how we work with those areas, especially in global south, in developing world?
Three things around that question. The first thing is that you want to mitigate risks in the project. Like you mentioned, if you go into a developing economy, you're going to potentially have more political risk, you will have more currency risk. So the idea is do not add more risks to something that's already a risky project, right? A proven technology may be a better solution to a country that has other risks. Bringing in somebody who can actually execute the project, right? One of the reasons the project here in the UAE was successful is they said, we want a vendor that has done the same thing over and over again somewhere else, and we want them to do it the end time here. So that's why they signed the contract with Korea. They could have chosen other technologies, and then maybe they would have been successful with those, but they said, we're a newcomer country. We have one person in this country that has nuclear education. We have to build an entire infrastructure, so let's not add more risk. That's the first thing. The second thing is that typically nuclear projects are kind of approached in a vacuum. You know, each country does its own thing. But if we're talking about 3 times nuclear, you know, to Dale's point, we really have to think about how do we band together and create these order books of projects, and how do we transfer some of the lessons learned, right, from project to project. So that's one way that countries in the developing world could team up with countries that are more mature, that have project development experience, and do it all in parallel so that project development experience is shared. And then third point, as I mentioned, you know, almost every single energy infrastructure project in the developing world is financed by the World Bank or one of the regional banks in very difficult countries, and it's done despite the currency risk, despite the political risk. They get these projects done. So if we had a bank that could do that for nuclear, I think that would be a big change.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, our panelists.